Okay, the topic is layers this time, and layers are pretty amazing in Photoshop because they allow you to have separate elements on different layers, up to 8,000 layers in Photoshop, and you can rearrange these layers, change the way that the layers interact with each other, change the order in which they're seen. You can cover up part of the layer, you can make part of the layer transparent and keep part of the layer opaque, or you can change the opacity or transparency of the entire layer all at once. So lots and lots of different ways to make layers your friend. Let me go through the layers panel first and kind of explain that. And first of all, let me preface this by saying we're doing 2 weeks on layers because there's so much about layers that really needs to be said and discussed and understood in order for you to fully appreciate what you can do in Photoshop with them. Okay, so tonight's going to be a little bit more of the palette and the panel itself and how we get around the panel and just the basics of how we operate layers. The next time we're going to talk about blend modes and clipping groups and some various things that we can do with layers. So right now, let's go to the layers panel. I put it over this side and made it a little bit bigger than usual just so you have a little bit better visibility. But this is your layers panel, and as you can see in this particular file I have now 6 layers. I have a white background layer, I have a little emoticon on this layer, and you can see if you look at these layers right here, there's a lot of checkerboard showing. If I click off the eyeball on any of these layers, it makes the layer temporarily invisible. And you can see that checkerboard pattern behind this now because the background layer is turned off and the background layer is filled with pure white. The checkerboard pattern indicates that it's a transparency. So whenever you see that checkerboard, you know that will not print anything. There is nothing there, and you can put it over top of something else and see whatever else is there underneath it. Okay? So I'm going to turn the background layer back on, and that's what we're going to talk about first, is the background layer. The background layer has some very specific characteristics to it. A background layer, if I go in the background layer and try and move it, it's going to give me this message that it can't move because the layer is locked. I have to change the name of the background layer in order to make it behave like a regular layer, but otherwise a background layer can't be moved unless you make a selection. I cannot make it transparent. If I go to the eraser tool, it's going to erase to whatever the background color is. So if I just undid that, so if I change this color to pinkish purple, it's going to, whatever the background color is, that's what it's going to erase to. So it's not going to make it transparent, in other words. And the other characteristic of a background layer is I cannot drag this background layer to any other spot in the layers panel. It must be the bottom layer. Okay, in order to change that, I can have to double click on it, and now I can give it a new name if I want. I can tell it paper white layer or whatever I want to name it, or just leave it as the default layer. Okay, but changing the name of it means now I can change the position of it, and now I can erase part of it, and it's going to act like a regular layer. All right, and I just clicked on the thumbnail and dragged it in order to change the positioning. That's very simply how you do it. Click and drag. Okay, so that's a background layer. We have regular layers, which if I click on one of these and use the move tool, you can see I can move them around very, very easily. Okay, so any of these guys, move them, click on the layer, and whatever layer is highlighted is the layer that I'm on. That is the active layer. That's what's going to take whatever I'm giving it, whether it's a paintbrush, whether it's, oh, sorry. Nope, that wasn't, oh, it's white on white. A paintbrush, whether it's a filter, if I add a noise filter here, okay, it's whatever I do on that layer, that is going to only happen on that layer, whatever operation I proceed. Okay, so I'm going to undo that. Okay, so that's regular layers. Let's look at what these little icons down at the bottom mean. Okay, this is your trash can. So if I come in here and click on the trash can when I'm on a layer, it's going to ask me if I really want to get rid of it, and I can say yes or no. And if I say yes, it disappears. I'm going to undo that. The other thing now with these later versions of Photoshop, if I just hit delete, you can just delete a layer. So you don't have to go down to the trash can anymore. You'll probably see me doing that, dragging down to the trash can just out of habit because I've been doing it for so long, and that delete key is a fairly new renovation in the latter version of Photoshop. Okay, so that's a trash can to get rid of a layer, or to get rid of a layer mask, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes. This icon right here creates a new blank layer. These little turning page icons, if you zoom in on this, if you were to zoom in on this, it looks like a little blank page with the corner turned up. That is in the bottom of many panels, like your channels panel here, for instance, or your swatches panel, your actions. There's a little, yeah, right there. All these different panels that many of them have this little turning page icon. That means a new of whatever panel you're in. So if you're in the channels panel, it's a new channel. If you're in the actions panel, it's a new action. If you're in the layers panel, it's a new layer. So a new blank layer, new blank action, whatever. Okay, so this is a create a group icon, and what that is I can click on that, and this is a way to organize your layers. So if I want to put all of these guys, I shift click these guys and drag them, I can drag them into a group, and now I can collapse the group so that you can see how much more organized that layers panel looks now. If I were to have 15 buttons on here, or 15 different elements that were all part of making one specific thing, for instance 15 parts of one of my alien monsters, then I could put them all in a single group and move it as a unit. So now when I'm got the group active, I can just use the move tool and they're all going to move together. It's kind of nice. All right. So that's a group. I can put more things into the group. I can take things out of the group, and I can rearrange. So you don't have to have things in a group permanently. You can change your mind about that. Okay. So that is this little icon. If I want to come back here, I'm going to go to history before I made my group and just get rid of this one, blank one. And I'm going to shift click on these three layers, and then click with the shift key down on the group. It's going to automatically put them into a group. So that's another way to put things into a group automatically. And I'm just going to name it circles. So we've got all those there. Bam. Nice. Okay. This icon right here is the adjustment layer. So what this does is it allows you to make adjustments to all the layers below doing any of these. So I'm going to choose hue and saturation. Now you see it went into the circles group because I was in there at the point when I made it. I'm just going to pull it above and click on that to collapse all that. When you click on here, if it doesn't show up right away, you'll have your properties menu over here. You'll have it should come up fairly close. I've got this on the opposite side of my screen than usual, just so I could make it as big as possible. The properties menu is available for whatever image adjustment you're using. So in this case, hue and saturation allows me to change the color of things greatly, which is kind of fun. So I'm going to get over and make, I like that one. That's pretty cool. Okay. So what that does is it affects every layer below it. I can make it not do that, and we'll talk about that in the next layers class by making a clipping group. But in this case, I just wanted to think of it as the difference between having eye surgery and wearing glasses. If I were to, I'm going to make this invisible and go into this layer and do the same thing. Come in, hue and saturation, and change the setting on this. Okay, so now what I've done is I've I put the change permanently onto that layer. So rather than being able to go back and get to the purple at this point, I've made a permanent change to those pixels. I'm going to undo that. In this case, however, this adjustment layer is more, that's like making the permanent change is like eye surgery. In this case, the adjustment layer is like a pair of glasses, sunglasses or glasses that change the color of things or glasses that make an adjustment to improve your vision. So that's what an adjustment layer is putting on a pair of glasses rather than having eye surgery. If you do the adjustments right on the layer, you're making permanent changes to the pixels. The advantage to that is if I want to change the amount of that change, I can bring the opacity down, I can bring it up, and I can also use the layer mask to make part of that change invisible. Again, we'll talk more about that as we go on. Okay, so that's an adjustment layer. That's hue and saturation. You can put on more than one adjustment layer. I could do color balance up here and move that around. There you go, like that. So you can stack your layer adjustments. You can put as many layer adjustment layers on as you like. So they're all down here. You've got the same, virtually the same list up here under adjustments. The thing is that they are more permanent and more and fixed to one layer when you do an image adjustment versus all the layers when you do an adjustment layer. Okay, the next icon is your layer mask. Okay, so I just mentioned that you could do, and I'm going to turn these two off just so we're working with the hue and saturation adjustment layer. Let me open this up a little bit more so you can see that is the hue and adjustment saturation layer. This is a layer mask, and every time you do an adjustment layer, you can see that it automatically puts on a layer mask. It actually put on an extra vector mask there. I'm going to delete it just because we don't need that at this point. You won't use those too often unless you're an illustrator. Okay, so what a layer mask does is it will allow whatever layer you're on, allow you to adjust the transparency of every single pixel of whatever layer you're on. So say for instance, I'm going to go down to this purple circle again. I want this circle to be half invisible but half opaque, half transparent, half opaque. So I'm going to use the gradient tool, black to white gradient tool, and I'm going to drag it from one side to the other side. Oh, sorry, I didn't make the layer mask first. Now you saw that that went over the whole layer. The reason I know it's going to affect just the layer mask is because this has the double border on the outside, and you can see that's what I'm working on. If I'm working on the layer, I'll have the double border on the layer itself, but I want to be working on the layer mask, which if you just made a layer mask will be your default. Drag that gradient from one side of the circle to the other, and you can see one edge disappears and one edge is completely opaque. You can see down here wherever the black is, that's where that layer is transparent. Wherever the white is, the layer is opaque, and where you get the transition in the middle, you get that soft flow from one side to the other side. So that is a layer mask. We can do the same thing up here for the layer mask with the hue and saturation layer. Say I like the way it looks for those two objects, but I don't like the way it looks for this green ball. So I can come in here and by Command or Control clicking on the thumbnail, the layer thumbnail for that layer, I can make a selection so that my painting or my filling of that won't affect anything but that the area that I've selected. Okay, so now if I'm on a brush right here and come in, I can come in and paint away the hue and saturation layer wherever I want it. And you can see over here, okay, that's black right there. That is where it is painted. Okay, so now if I came back here and moved the green circle, the second green circle, I'm moving it away from the part where it was masked out so that I now still am getting that hue and saturation. So I need to move that with it if I want to move it. I have to move that area with it or somehow connect those two. I could bring that down here and clip those to each other if I wanted, but again, we'll do that the next time in Layers Chapter 2. Okay? So I'm going to get rid of the hue and saturation layer. I just wanted to demonstrate a layer mask because you're going to be using those very soon. You're going to run into those as you read this week too. Sorry, click on the layer thumbnail to get rid of those. I just want to simplify this a little bit. Okay, so we have a layer group. We have 3 layers in it, which are buttons, but we want those buttons lined up. Let me finish out, yeah, I want to show you this before I complete down the layer styles and linking layers. But if say you want to, and I'm going to get rid of this layer mask, again, if you want to apply that layer mask permanently, you hit apply. And what that will do is it will make that edge permanently transparent. So I can apply, the layer mask will disappear. There isn't a layer mask, but it has erased that side and kind of smoothed the way to the opaque side. It's made that transparency and opacity completely permanent now on that layer. Okay, undo that, and if I want to just get rid of it without making any changes, I want to delete the layer mask, it goes back to the way it was. Alright, so say I want to take these layers, and if I shift click them, I can move them around together. I can transform them together, make them smaller, hit the enter or return key to make the transformation stick. I can turn them around, again using the transformation tool. I can skew them and distort them. I can do all kinds of things by shift clicking them, but maybe I want to make them evenly spaced here. So when we go to the move tool, we have that option up here. I can line them to the left edge together, and then I can distribute them so that they're perfectly evenly distributed. And again, because they're all selected at this point, when I move them, they move all together. Okay? So if I wanted to have more space between them, I'd just take the red circle and move it away a little bit, and maybe then hit the shift to select all of them and redistribute them. Okay? So that's a simple way to get things very evenly spaced. Works really, really nicely. Okay. So that is distributing and aligning, and that's up here, and you need to have your move tool activated with a shift click more than one layer in order to get that. Okay. Auto select is something that is on by default in Photoshop, and I tend to turn it off because what it does is when you click on anything, you can see how it goes to that layer automatically. I use the keyboard shortcut instead, which is hold down the 3 keys to the left of the space bar, and it does the same thing. And that way I'm not clicking here on something that I'm working on and then automatically going to that layer and then getting myself lost. So I tend to turn auto select off. Okay, now let's go back down to layer effects, and I'm going to go up to our purple circle again for layer effects or layer styles. It used to, that's the old name of it, used to be effects, and that's why the FX is there. That was the shortcut for that, like FX in the movies and stuff. But they've changed the name to layer style, and they changed that ages ago, but they never changed that little icon because it is very succinctly telling you what layer styles do. They kind of create special effects for your layers. So if I click on the layer effects for, or the layer styles for the layer, what it does is it puts, you can see right here, it's already put effects on that layer of bevel and emboss, because that's the one I'm in. And if I have to click on the name of the layer style that I want to apply to that layer. And you can see what it's doing is it's popping out the layer content there and making it three-dimensional. Smooth is your default, inner bevel smooth is your default. The size is by how much it goes from the edge, how much up it goes from the edge. The depth is how high it appears to go. And the softness is how smooth the transition will be. And that's going to be more noticeable if you do chisel hard than smooth. So if I change the softness, see how that changes? Much more noticeably with chiseling rather than with the inner bevel. You've got a number of different settings here that you can try. Pillow Emboss kind of puts it into the surface, kind of indents it into the surface as if it hit the surface like a meteor hits the earth and makes a pocket for it, and it puts it right down in there. Inner bevel pops it out of the surface. And then you've got outer bevel, which used to be the default, not quite as useful for me. I really like inner bevel and sometimes pillow emboss. And then if you put a stroke on this, if I put a stroke with a different color so we can see it, and I'm going to make it wide enough so you can also see it, and then come back to bevel and emboss. You can put the bevel and emboss, on the stroke alone, which is kind of an interesting effect. So you can see it's not affecting the inside there nearly as much. It's pretty much limiting that bevel and emboss to the stroke this time rather than coming inside. So these are all options in just the first one, which is just bevel and emboss. Contour allows you to kind of put a different surface on it. By default, the straight diagonal one gives you a very smooth contour, but if you go to some of these that are shaped like W's and M's, they start looking more metallic depending on what your surface is, what color your surface is. This isn't really doing it, but if it were a gold or a silver surface or a little bit different looking, it would definitely do it. If I were to come in here and put a gradient on that, I'm going to command click or control click on that to make sure the gradient stays right in that one area, and then just put that side to side. Don't want it to be radial. There we go, side to side. Okay, so there's my button. Now I go back to layer styles, bevel and emboss, and put the soft edge on it, go to contour, and you should see how it starts to look. It's breaking up the jaggies there. We're getting jaggies all over the place, but it's starting to look a little more shiny surfaced, a little more metallic. And depending on, you need enough resolution. There isn't too much resolution in this one. So, which next week's topic, resolution and image size, all that good stuff. Okay, so that is contour. It's kind of a way to add a little bit of gloss to it. Then you can also add texture under bevel and emboss. So depending on the pattern you use, you're going to get different patterns here that are going to be put right into the surface of your button. They only affect what's on that layer. So if this is all that's on the layer, that's all that's going to be affected by this. And you can also put the same pattern on it down here. So if I wanted to put that button pattern on, it changes a little bit down here. It's not quite as three-dimensional looking as that, but it's in normal mode. Yeah, see, it just overwrites it. If you do it in bevel and emboss, it makes it more or less three-dimensional. So that's kind of the difference between pattern overlay and texture in bevel and emboss. Okay, so next you saw me do the stroke. You can put a stroke on anything. You can put it inside, you can put it outside, and you can put it in the center. If you're doing something rectangular, something that has 90-degree edges, something that has square or hard edges, use inside, otherwise it'll round your edge on you, which you may not want. You probably won't want. You can do an inner shadow, which makes like a little crescent shadow. You can see Let me do hard edge. There you go. See the crescent shadow there? Depending on your angle, that's where it's going to fall. So if I'm at 90 degrees here, I can put in 90, type in 90. It's going to be straight on the top. If I want that to be softer edged, I put the size up, and you can see how that affects that. And we have gloss contour here, a contour. And you do generally want it anti-aliased. So anti-aliasing is going to make things smoother at edges. Okay, so that's inner shadow. I'm going to turn off stroke and inner shadow. Inner glow is going to be giving something a little bit of glow or whiteness, a lightness. Okay, and you can work from the edge or you can work from the center. So you can see, work to the center, work to the edge. You can see how that works. And get in here and look at some of these pull down menus, because that is going to sometimes make a big difference in the way things look to you. And you can really tailor things exactly to what you want it to be. Jittering usually means variation, and in this case you can see it varies the opacity. It makes it look kind of crispy or crunchy. More like snow rather than like a smooth transition. Okay, satin covers it up with a color, depending usually, and I think multiply is your blend mode there. You can come in, and we're going to talk about blend modes in the second week of layers, so don't worry too much about them. You can play with them a little bit, see what they do, but I'll explain them much more thoroughly in the second week we talk about that. So satin, not one of my favorites. I don't use it all that much. Color overlay just covers over whatever's on the layer with the color in the color swatch. You can see I've only got the opacity, had it at 27%, which is why it wasn't covering everything over. You still get the layer style that you put on here, that texture, even though you put on the blend mode here, put on the color overlay, it will still keep that bevel and emboss for you, including the texture, which is nice to know about. Okay, again, you can bring the opacity of that down so it doesn't cover up the color, but kind of just gives it a color cast if you want. And to change the color, click in the little color square and pick a new color. Okay, so that's color overlay. Gradient overlay, I've got the same gradient here that I just picked, so you can pick a different gradient, put it over. You can make a new gradient, and we'll talk about that in more detail in a future class. You can change the angle of the gradient. You can change whether it's radial, or you can change whether it's angular. You can change whether it's reflected or diamond shape. So, you know, look at the difference all that makes and how many variations you've got. Just this one dialog box, how cool this is. Okay, so I'm going to put it at linear. And let's make it 90 degrees right there. And you can also change the scale of it. So if I want it to be a little bit bigger, or if I want it to be a little bit smaller, you know, you can do a number of different things. Every time you've got one of these pull down, fly out menus, check it out and see what's hiding under there. I've got this reverse, so I can click that off and it goes back to the way it was. I don't have to align it with layer, but I can. So, and you can make any of these your default setting or reset it to whatever the default setting was set at. So that may save you time if you're doing stuff. I'm going to keep that on for a minute, and then I'm going to go to pattern overlay. Actually, I'm going to turn this off and turn texture off for the moment, and go to pattern overlay, which I showed you. Try using the blend modes with this, especially these middle blend modes, overlay, soft light, hard light. And look at the different, you may not have as many, but you'll probably have a few, and you can load in a number of different ones. I'll show you how to do that in a future class, but you should have some patterns in here already, so you can kind of experiment with those and get the hang of it at least at this point. So if I have time enough after I explain layers, I may show you how to do patterns today. Okay, so that's patterns. Pattern overlay. Okay, so I'm going to click on gradient overlay and texture again, And you've got an outer glow here, and you've got a drop shadow. Drop shadow is really cool because you can, I'm going to put the size down to 0. When the size is at 0, it's a very hard edge shadow. The distance is how close it is to the object that's being shadowed. The spread, if I have the size up, will go bigger and smaller. The size actually softens the edge of the shadow. Okay, so that makes it a soft edge shadow, or you can have a hard edge shadow. Very soft edge, very diffuse, or very hard edge, depending on how you set the size. But you don't have to put in the numbers here. You can come over here and just click and drag that shadow around. Now notice the bevel and embossing as I drag this out of the way. See, I've got a lightness over here and the shadow over here from the bevel and embossing. Watch as I move the drop shadow around, how the bevel and embossing follows to make it consistent with the lighting that would cause that shadow. If you don't want that consistent lighting, if you don't want it to look like the lighting's all coming from the same direction, click off the Use Global Light option. That will allow me to move the drop shadow without moving any of the lighting from the bevel and emboss. Okay? If you click on the Use Global Light, then it's all going to be consistent lighting. Okay? Most of the time you're going to want to keep the Use Global Lighting on. And the nice part about the drop shadow again is that you can move it around WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. Now, if you get this so that you like it, so that you really want to reuse this style at some point, this collection of layer styles, click on the new style icon and button with pop-up dots. Okay, and click OK. Now you can go into the styles window here, and I can come back to my green circle layer and I can click on that, and if I move out you'll see it just applied the same layer styles to that one. Come over here, click, and it applied exactly the same layer styles to that one. Okay, so that is one easy way to bring layer styles to more than one layer. If you're doing interface for web, for instance, that's a great way to do it. See, I just dragged off the layer styles because I want to show you another way of copying layer styles. Hold down your Option or your Alt key and click on the name Effects and drag it to another layer, and it will make that layer style copy over to the next layer. You can always turn off layer styles completely, or you can turn off a piece of the layer style, whatever layer style you. So I can turn off the drop shadow or on the drop shadow, off the gradient, on the gradients. Okay, so you've got, every time you've got an eyeball, you can click it to turn on or off the visibility of that particular item, layer style, layer, etc. Okay, so those are layer styles. Let me tell you one more thing about layer styles. I'm going to come in here and tell it to, and this is very cool stuff, I like this a lot. I want to come in here and tell it to go to layer style, create layers. Okay, it's going to put all those layer styles for that layer on separate layers, including the drop shadow. So that is cool, because if I want to come down to the drop shadow layer and I want this drop shadow to not look like a standard drop shadow, I'm clicking with the controller command key on, but like a drop shadow that would happen if I had light coming from a direction where I wanted it to not fall directly against a wall in back of the object, but on the floor in back of the object. Now, remember those layer masks? I can add a layer mask and use a gradient here, a black to white gradient, because black makes that layer invisible or transparent, and white makes that layer stay opaque, and come in here, and that way the drop shadow now comes, I can make it fade off the way a real drop shadow would fade off. So now you can see how cool it is that we can take and create layers from those layer styles and make them separate from the layer itself. Now the disadvantage of this is they no longer behave like layer styles in that I can't go back to the layer styles. See back up here, these are separate layers now. I can't go back in here and readjust those layer styles on this layer because I've made them separate layers. So that's the only disadvantage, but I do this all the time with drop shadows. Take the drop shadow off and put it on its own layer so I can transform that drop shadow and make it look more like a real life drop shadow would look and should look. Okay, so that is a really cool hint that you're going to find very useful in your future in Photoshop is create layers from layer styles. And when you do that, you always end up back on the layer, the original layer, so you have to go to your drop shadow layer in order to transform your drop shadow. Now it's on its own layer still, so I can still come in here and move that drop shadow around if I want. So I'm going to come in and just select that part of it, and I can still, if I want to adjust it further, say the ball is bouncing a little bit, there we go, and now we've got the ball up a little bit and bouncing. So you got so many options that are so great and so much fun. Okay, so that is layer styles. The last thing to talk about, and I'm going to go back before I created layers, just so I don't have all these. When you have a bunch of layer styles, you can collapse them by clicking that triangle, and that will, you'll know you've got layer styles because of the fact you've got the little FX key there, the little FX icon, but you have to click the little down arrow to get to see them now, to make them accessible. But they're still working over here, they're just fine. Okay, so now what I want to do is to show you how to link layers. That's the last thing in this bunch of options. So if I shift click two layers and go here, now I've got the little chain available to me. What that means is I've got two layers here that can that will move together as a unit. They're kind of tied together now. So that's what linking layers is. We used to do it all the time before we could shift click layers. I'm going to unlink them for the same by doing the same thing, just clicking with them highlighted. You could click on either one of these. If one of these layers, sorry, let me shift click and link them. If I were on either one of these layers, they will move together as a unit when they're linked. So I don't have to shift click them. If I unlink them, either one of them, it unlinks both layers. Okay? So that is covering everything down at the bottom of your layers panel. And then let's talk a little bit about up here at the top, if people will stop messaging me. One of the things you have up here is locking the layers. And you have a bunch of different options. And you're going to read about this in your book. I know you will, because every time I get projects, everybody's locking their layers. So I know you guys are looking at this. But let me just explain. This locks the layer so that you can't do anything to it. And most of the time, you're going to want these options, this option, if you're working in a multi-user office where many people are looking at your file and you don't want them to screw up what you've done. You want them to at least have to stop and look and, oh yeah, she's locked this layer, he's locked this layer, and they don't want me touching it. That's basically what it's kind of for. Or if you want to make sure you don't do anything on a specific layer, you want to keep one layer absolutely pristine. Most of the time I'm using this first lock, which is lock transparent pixels. And what that does, I'm on the green bubble here, is if I use my brush tool now, because that layer is locked, it won't let me draw on any of the area of that layer where there aren't already pixels. So in other words, there are only pixels where there is where the button is. So if I come over here and try and use my brush tool, I'm trying and it's black, it won't work. If I come over here, however, it will work on the button because I've locked the transparent pixels so I cannot paint on anything transparent. I cannot run a filter on anything transparent. So if I come up here and tell it to add noise, there's adding noise. If I come up here and tell it to blur, Gaussian blur, and it's blurring like crazy. Okay, so that's what's happening. Is if you want to make sure that you don't put any color on anything except what's on that specific layer already, this is a great way to do it. And I'll give you some more examples of how this is very, very useful in the future. But I just want to explain about the locking right now, and you'll read more about it. You can search your layers now. If you have a file with a whole bunch of layers, you can search by the name. So if I want to come in here and search for all the layers that start with EMO, I get my emoticon layer. Okay, I'm going to take that out. I can search by effect, which is by if I have a stroke on it or bevel and emboss on it. It should show me those because they're just stacked, right? Yeah, it's not showing. Maybe I have to show those in order to have them come up. That is something that kind of came out new. They must have to show. Oh, the stroke is one. That's why. I didn't have any with strokes, so that isn't. Effects, and we have drop shadows on those. Okay, so it's going to show me all the layers that have those effects. I'd forgotten we didn't have any with strokes. Okay, so we also have mode, which is blend modes. We'll talk about that in the next layers class. We have attributes, which are whether it's visible or not, whether it's locked or not. Do I have any locked layers? No, I don't. Do I have any empty layers? No, I don't. So you can go ahead and search through here and do I have any linked layers? Do I have any clipped layers? Do I have any layers that are not visible? So, okay, so we can search by all those attributes as well, and we can search by color. We can search as whether there's a smart object, and we can search whether they are selected, and we can also search the artboard. So let me talk just briefly about opacity. So I'm going to come back up here. We have the opacity slider, which allows me to change the opacity. You can see that kind of copper colored button is disappearing as I bring the slider down. I can use a scrubby option up here and just drag. I can put a number here, any number I want, or I can hit the numbers at the top of my keyboard. The number 3, for instance, if I am in the move tool, the number 3 will change it to 30% opaque, 6, 60%, 9, 90%, 0, 100%, 1, 10%. So 10 times whatever the number you hit except for the 0, which is 100%. We'll change the opacity of the layer. That's a really quick and easy way to change the opacity. The fill is changes the original pixels of the layer, but not the bevel and emboss, any of the layer styles. So if I come in here and change this to 0, I no longer see any of the original pixels of the layer. I only see the layer styles. So I see, let me come in here and do it to this one. And you can see all the color, the original color, all the pixels originally there disappear. So all we see are the layer styles that we have here. If I take off the gradient, it's gone. If I put on the gradient there, it's gone. All we're seeing are the layer styles if we change the fill to 0. So you can change it to any number you want. You can bring it back partially, but that's if you want something to just show the layer styles and not the layer, that's how you do it, is with the fill option. Okay? And the other way to control opacity is with a layer mask, and that changes any pixel on the layer, not just the whole layer. That's the difference between opacity and a layer mask, is you're changing the opacity of a layer with a layer mask at any point in that layer, any place in that layer, to any desired amount of transparency. But you just do wholesale changes with these sliders up here. It changes the entire layer. Okay. Layer. Let's look at smart objects just a little bit. Convert to smart object. If you have a smart object, you see the little icon down in the thumbnail right there. That indicates it's a smart object. That means it behaves differently. I can't come in here and paint this anymore. It won't allow me to do that right now. I have to double click on this, and what it will do is it will open up that object as a separate file. Now I can come in and paint if I want. I've got a gradient overlay on that. I've got all kinds of things on here. Let me change the bevel and emboss and put a stroke on there. Okay, now I want to save it, and I can close it. And see, when I go back, now it's changed. So that's what a smart object is. Now, what's the point of a smart object? A smart object allows you to embed objects into a file that can be reused and reused and reused. For instance, you can use your logo as a smart object. You can bring stuff in from Camera Raw, your raw files, as a smart object, which means you're not changing any pixels in this file. You have to actually purposely go back and change the original file in order to change it. The other advantage of using a smart object is now I can use smart filters. So I can come in here and do Gaussian blur. And remember when I tried to blur it before, it didn't blur the layer styles, it just blurred what was in there. Now it's blurring everything because I'm blurring the smart object. Okay, so I'm going to blur it, but now remember our layer masks? Well, that's kind of how the smart filters work. So if I don't want the blur to be over here, I just paint this part with black. Okay, I'm going to go to 100%, and it brings back the sharpness. So I'm painting away the smart filter wherever I paint it with black. And I can leave it or paint it back in wherever I paint with white. So now I'm painting with white. So now I paint the blur back in. So you can do that with any filter if you change your layer to a smart object. And it doesn't have to be, it can be, you can change multiple layers into a single smart object, or you can change one single layer with nothing else on it into a smart object. But the advantage is it's an extra layer of ability to reuse that object, and you have the ability to make smart filters. Those are the two big, huge advantages of smart objects. Everything you've got up in here, many of the things you've got up in here are available in this flyout menu as well. You've got those up here. You can merge your layers. If I want to merge two layers together, say I wanted to merge this layer with the layer below it, I can use Command E, or I can go merge layer. It won't merge with a smart object like that, so you've got to bring it down. I'm going to bring it down here and merge it with that layer. So merge visible, merge down. Command E merges down, so those two layers are now merged into one layer. You can merge visible, which takes all the visible layers that you've got and merges them together. Now, what if you wanted to merge everything but the background layer? Just make, undo. Okay, I just lost my background layer there. There we go. Oh, I didn't have one, that's why. Okay, so I'm going to put a layer underneath that, and the way you put a layer underneath, and this is super not told very many places, is hold your Command or your Control key down when you click on the new layer icon. It puts a layer under the layer you're on instead of on top of the layer you're on. And I'm going to fill it with white. So say I wanted to not have my layer merge with that one. It is doing strange things to me today. That's bizarre. My Photoshop may be having a little bit of a hissy fit because I've been working with such big files. So anyway, oh, that's because I've got the attributes set. That's what's going on. Operator error. Okay. See, it happens to me too. If I don't want it to merge with that background layer, but I want everything else to merge into one layer, go to Merge Visible instead. You have to be on one of the layers to make it merge visible. Merge Visible, and it will merge everything but the layer, and then you just turn the visibility back on. That way you can move all of this stuff around as a unit. It's all in one layer if you want to do that. So Merge Visible is good. If you go to Flatten, it puts everything on one layer and it becomes a new background layer. So now we don't, everything is together and you can't pull them apart and do anything with them separately unless you make a selection and start all over again. Okay? So you probably don't want to flatten anything while you're working on it. I don't flatten anything permanently. I save a copy with all my layers and then I save a copy as a flattened layer, JPEG or PNG or whatever, if I have to send it to somebody. So I'm not cutting off my possibilities, in other words. I think that is about all I wanted to cover for. You can export layers now, so you can tell it what size to do, export all and stuff, so that's kind of fun. You can export it as a PNG, which is nice. That gives you some more options. I didn't have that many layers to do, but you can export a single layer, and that's kind of nice. Quick export, you can quick export layers as PNGs here if you want to. Those are fairly new options in Photoshop. Copy a layer, Command or Control J copies the whole layer. If you make a selection of part of the layer, it will, Command or Control J will just copy and paste part of that layer. To see just one layer at a time, hold down the Option or Alt key and click on the eyeball, and that will show you just that one layer. To bring back the visibility of all the layers that were on before you did that, just do it again. Okay, so that's a really handy way of finding things sometimes. If you can't find what's on a layer, you want to see what everything else, where everything else is kind of, you want to see a layer without the distraction of everything else. That's a really great way to do it. Okay, we have a long chat here, and that is about all for tonight. I hope that was really helpful, and remember to post in the discussion area every week at least once to get your credit. More if you have questions or want comments from other people. I love the contributions. Those are fantastic, and the comments are great as well. Have a great week, and I'll talk to you soon.